Coming up in this episode of the Innovating Higher Ed podcast, Dr. Norma Jones welcomes Professor Chesa Caparas of Anza College, a leading expert in media literacy and AI strategy for higher education. Drawing on her international education and research as a Fulbright scholar in the Philippines on social media disinformation, Chesa lays out a framework for introducing AI that respects academic integrity, supports overworked educators, and bridges global connectivity gaps. Join us as we boldly explore new frontiers in educational innovation.
I'm here with Professor Chesa Caparas from Anza College.
Thank you so much for having me and for providing space to have these conversations.
Thank you for joining me on this podcast. So one of the most impressive and important things that I learned from you, hearing you speak and from our prior conversations, is that it's an interesting balance that human, teacher, fellow human being that like we constantly have to juggle. How do you think this might affect teachers? Because one of the most impressive, important things that I've taken with me and kind of it has changed my way of thinking about AI in education is that faculty have not only the right, but we should be able to mourn. Things have changed
Yeah.
and that we need that space. And how do you think that all goes together? Because do we as teachers need that empathy as well? Do we as teachers
Yes.
need that space?
Yes, definitely. And that's like every time I lead like AI professional development for educators, I always start with like, let's acknowledge that we're all burned out. I haven't met a single teacher that thought COVID was the best thing to happen to teaching, right? Educators might have enjoyed certain parts of it. They're like, yeah, I get to like teach in my pajamas from home, or I don't have to commute anymore. Like, sure, there were aspects of it, but ultimately, like, it was so stressful. There was so much pressure on us, right? So much blame about like, what the hell are you even doing for our students, for our kids? I think K through 12 had a harder time. At community college level, right? Like, we had to basically change how we did things overnight. I had some colleagues who, prior to COVID, had never used like a learning management system, had, never taught online. And so
Right.
when they transitioned, they're like, you know what, I'm just going to have my students email me all their assignments. I'm like, that
Ah!
sounds terrifying. I was like, that sounds like an administrative nightmare. I was like, good luck to you, but like, I don't think I could do that. Like, the empathy that I have for the students, I definitely try to have for my colleagues, because, we were all in it. Like, we had to retool everything. We had to learn new technologies. We had to learn new teaching strategies, like new pedagogy, basically. Like, how do you engage somebody, and do you make them turn the camera on? Do you not? What is the like equitable thing to do, right? How do you get them to like just even participate? And being that sort of like humanizing, heart-centered teacher, it's like, how do you create a safe space for them to tell you what's going on while you're also holding space for yourself and everything that's going on? So when I talk about AI, I always start with like, look, if you don't have capacity to rethink what you're doing, that is okay, right? If you are terrified and don't want to think about how to redo what you're doing because you're already exhausted by having to redo it, I understand, like, acknowledge that, like, take care of yourself, however you need to take care of yourself. And I always say, like, my goal isn't to force everybody to adopt AI. My goal as any educator is to give information and knowledge so that people feel empowered to make their own decisions with how they're going to use it, if they're going to use it. But then it's also important for us. I'm about to lead a professional development workshop, and I sent out like a pre-survey where I was like, what do you want to talk about? Like, what would be most useful? And of course, there's a lot of angry responses about about like, oh, students they're cheating, they're not thinking anymore. And I can understand where those responses are coming from. But I also think that it makes certain assumptions about where our students are. It makes assumptions that like they don't want to do the work because they have no morals, which is not necessarily the case. Maybe they don't have capacity to do the work because they're driving their grandmother to the hospital and working 12-hour shifts and then coming home and taking care of their own kids. And that's the thing that I try to remind our colleagues about, is that we need to have empathy for ourselves, and likewise, like, have some empathy or compassion for what our students might be going through that leads them to make choices around AI usage. You know what I mean?
That is such a holistic way of looking at it. I feel like you hit it dead on. It's not teacher versus student versus AI versus administration, right? It's
Mhm.
really us all grappling together to figure out how to move forward
Yeah.
together as
Yeah.
human beings.
Yeah.
And when you told me that, I don't know if you saw my brain blow up at the time, but I think I did one of those like hard resets where I said, wait a minute, it went bzz for a minute. And it was such a brilliant way of thinking about it because I have a bad habit of just jumping in the deep end,
Mhm.
right? I'm one of those that's, "Oh, let's just try this." This helped me reframe it in a way that was so smart, that to be able to really consider the whole human and, teachers as humans, students as humans, that this is all something that we're grappling with, and how do we have empathy and heart-centered for everybody? That helped
Mhm.
me so much, and I really wanted to share that with everybody.
Oh,
Um
I'm so glad. Yay.
One of the coolest things I think too is that once we think about it this way, right, that it is about how to help, then once you get that out there, this is something you can try. Hey, we're all in this together. Do you feel like teachers are a little bit less apprehensive? What are you seeing?
I think that a lot of times folks start off resistant to me or any AI professional development
Mhm,
opportunity because they see it as somebody shoving AI down their throat. Like that's definitely a phrase I've heard over and
mhm,
over again. People are shoving it down my throat. And I get it. If I wasn't on this side of it, like knowing what I know, I would probably feel the same way, right? Like there's so
mhm,
many mandates that we have to comply with. But once I say, like, hey, I'm just as skeptical and afraid of AI as all of you, which is
mhm,
why I've decided to learn how to use it, I think it like kind of softens them a little bit, or at least says, oh, okay, maybe I want to hear what she has to say. Because I think it's full of problems, right? I think that
mhm.
there's so many, there's like bias, and this is what I've been studying even before ChatGPT came out. Like
Yeah, yeah.
there's bias, there's like, social behavioral manipulations that can be done with it, that have been done with it, right? There's disinformation, there's so many different ways that it has eroded like the glue of our civilization, which is why I'm like, we need to understand how it works so we can try and repair that. It's not that I think like, hey, here's a shiny AI tool, everybody learn how to use it. It's like, hey, here's a shiny AI tool that people are trying to sell you. Let's figure out why they're trying to sell it to you and how they're actually benefiting from it in a way that may or may not hurt us. And how do we push back slash like educate ourselves so that we're not like taken advantage of by these new technologies.
Could we talk about that as a Fulbright scholar, what you studied, how you address that? Because one of the most important things I think about social media is that we are the commodity. We are being packaged and sold,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
And what you talked about, how AI potentially is doing that at a grander scale. And that's why
Mm-hmm.
it's so scary.
So my research, I decided on the Philippines. I had applied for the Fulbright in 2019. I just wanted to look at the role that social media and algorithms was playing on, or the role that it had in disinformation and education. But that was 2019, and then I got accepted for the Fulbright in February of 2020, and then it happened in March of 2020, which was everything shut down. So my project had to switch, and then I reframed my project because it looked like I was going to be able to go in 2022 when the next national elections were going to happen in the Philippines. And it was a very, very contentious election. There's a lot of disinformation circulating about candidates. And I was curious, like, how people were navigating that, how educators were trying to teach media and information literacy. What was the impact on like a sense of democracy or even just on democratic processes? There was a bunch of learning loss that was documented in 2022, the year that I went. A report on learning poverty in Southeast Asia and the Philippines, I think, ranked the lowest in terms of reading proficiency. It's a country that has like the highest penetration of Facebook in the world. For several years in a row, Philippines ranked number one in countries who's like people who spent time online, as in like Filipinos spent the most time online in the world. So you have tons of time online, a lot of social media usage, and this very contentious national election that is sort of riddled with disinformation. So that's why I decided to study that. But primarily I was looking at educators and what was the impact of trying to teach media information literacy given this climate. And as we were talking about before, one of the biggest takeaways I had is that there is so much pressure put on teachers to, sort of fix society's problems, to sort of like teach students how to understand information and make better choices. And yet the educators themselves don't have the resources. If you think about how many more people get their information from social media, from the internet, like in the classroom, it's a huge uphill battle. And these tools are designed that way, right? Like social media is designed to capture our attention. How is a teacher supposed to compete with the infinite scroll of TikTok? You can't. And then, of course, during the pandemic, a lot of us tried, right? I got a TikTok. I started making educational content on social media to try and keep my students engaged. But it's good for some things, but long form journalism, like quarter semester long educational experiences in community with other human beings have so much importance in someone's educational development, their intellectual and social development. One of the things I learned is how difficult it is for teachers. And that's, I think, a lot of what informed why I always open my professional development workshops with like empathy and compassion for educators. That was the biggest takeaway from my research was, I used the term emotional labor by Arlie Russell Hochschild, which gets misused a lot because people think it just means that you like work with your feelings. And that's not exactly it. Like, I mean, it's like an entire book and a lot of sort of applications of it. Basically, it just means how we sort of manage our feelings in order to appear professional, right? So as educators, we have to repackage or tamp down our feelings of like anxiety, fear, distrust, all of these things in order to seem like we know what we're doing. And her research, she looks at like flight attendants and a lot of people who work in the service industry whose job it is to pretend they're providing a service happily, right? Even if someone's treating them like complete garbage, you know.
This is so important. You talked about fixing society's problems.
Yeah.
And I see so many teachers. I think you and I both give multiple professional developments. And what's interesting is even at my school, even at various places where I feel that teachers are constantly saying, how do I check that we have authentic learning? How do I check that we're not over reliant on AI? How do I check for these things? And multiple times I've said, I've tried to convince people this is a global problem, just like the Facebook. And I'm seeing a lot of parallels. Facebook, the way it penetrates societies, the way it manipulates societies potentially. Social media can manipulate emotions in societies. And how do we, as mere teachers, stand up, right, to something like that and try to fix it for our students? And we really want to, because that's the core of what we do.
Yeah.
Juggling that anxiety of I have to make sure that my students learn something from this
Mm-hmm.
and to make sure that they aren't overtaken by it, and to fix, heavy quotation marks, a problem that the world is grappling with.
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of parallels between what you saw in the Philippines and what we're dealing with now.
Yeah, and especially as we are facing a lot of attacks on education. So not only is there a lot of pressure for us to do this work, but at the same time, like we're losing funding for, some of the ways that we have found, that research has shown are actually helpful for student success, right? We're losing credibility. There's financial under resourcing, but there's also sort of like cultural under
Mhm.
resourcing. It's just like a double-edged sword, It feels like our hands are tied sometimes. And how do we ensure or even evaluate authentic learning? And I think this is another reason why I open with the caveat, like if you don't have capacity for this, it's okay. I mean, this has been years in the making, but generative AI has really forced a conversation around what the hell are we actually assessing when we're creating assessments. Like I teach English, and so our bread and butter is the essay. It's like, what exactly am I trying to evaluate through an essay? You know? And I'm not saying that they're pointless. I'm saying that we have to
Right.
reflect on what exactly is the purpose of each of our assessments, right? And we also have to ask ourselves, like, what does learning even mean, right? Because like learning and intelligence, I think we have to update or at least have like really thoughtful conversations about what we mean by intelligence. Because like one form of intelligence is just like, how do you apply knowledge in one area to new contexts? And so in that sense, when my students are using generative AI to complete an assignment, you might consider that a form of intelligence, right? Because they are like, oh, there's this new tool. I can use this new tool to get this job done. And getting this job done equals success. Therefore, it's an intelligence because they're like, here's a tool that helps me get it done faster.
Mhm.
Of course, if you have a policy or you have a certain expectation, could say that that's cheating. I also think that that's why we have to have this deeper conversation around what does it mean to demonstrate intelligence? What does it mean to demonstrate learning? And one example that I have been kind of thinking about, one of my kids, our youngest, is a senior in high school and, wants to major in computer science. And lately he has been writing a bot that can beat Tetris. I know. And it's interesting because my initial reaction was like, but don't you like playing Tetris? Right?
Mhm.
Don't you enjoy Tetris? And he's like, yeah, but I also enjoy creating a bot that can beat Tetris. These are the new like assessments. These are the new forms of learning. I don't want to just say young people because all of us could create bots or whatever. That is innovation, right? That is learning. That is a different form of intelligence. It's like, sure, maybe in the past, playing Tetris was the game.
Mhm.
And now creating bots that can beat Tetris is the new game.
Right.
That's kind of where my head has been lately.
We all went to school to get trained to do a certain thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then we now have to, as teachers, and you're going to school some more, you're going
Mm-hmm.
for another master's?
Mm-hmm.
Why did you switch from literature to knowledge structure at Columbia?
The full program is called Information and Knowledge Strategy.
Okay.
So it's a combination of like information science, like knowledge management, sort of strategic planning. But really, it's like I did my Fulbright. I did research on like sort of the role of social media disinformation and how educators are trying to teach media information literacy. When I came back from my Fulbright, I came back September of 2022. ChatGPT became a thing November of 2022. And I was like, oh my
Right.
God, like I was on sabbatical. I mean, again, like it
Mhm.
was a privilege. I was on sabbatical
Mhm.
actually studying AI and education. So then ChatGPT came out and I had all this time to just kind of figure out like what the hell is going on. So I decided to apply for another master's. I wanted
Mhm.
to learn more about AI, but not like a super technical degree. So I was looking for something
Mhm.
interdisciplinary. And I also knew that I wanted to have that sort of higher level understanding of like how to help large institutions or organizations integrate or adopt AI into, not just teaching and learning, but into operations and those kinds of things and like do more strategic planning.
This is so interesting. My degree is actually communication and information.
Okay.
Even though I have a more of a communication leaning, it's the idea is that we're still moving information in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions I get, and I feel like maybe you might be getting some of this, is a lot of our colleagues that we hang out with, a lot of them are in computer sciences.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
remember very early on, a couple folks were it's like, "You're the talking type. You're the speech teacher, right? Why are you here?
Yeah.
What's going on here?" And
Yeah.
I think with your understanding of literature and the way things move and the way information moves, and from the communication perspective of how we exchange information,
Mm-hmm.
the exchange of information typically has a goal.
Mm-hmm.
We want something, or someone wants something from us.
Mm-hmm.
And this is such an interesting way of connecting the human with the technology.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I love that. I love that because that's so true. It really like, and I had this really great conversation with, one of our other
Mhm.
sort of educators in this AI space, Anna Mills. And we were talking about how like, I can see why instructors feel hurt when, their student writes an essay using generative AI
Right.
because the purpose of writing and communication is to have a connection with another human being, right?
Mhm.
And when you feel like you're getting this like computer generated like crap, basically, I mean, it's not, I mean, whatever, it's like, it's just cookie cutter, right? It
Right.
feels like you're not communicating with like an authentic human being. And that's where I think a lot of the anger comes from, you know?
Oh,
Yeah.
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 That makes a lot of sense, right? It's I put all this heart and soul into these things for you, and you
Mhm.
respond by literally typing 4 things into a computer and
Yeah.
handing me something that's on a calculator.
Right. Yeah. And it's really funny because students feel the same way. I actually, in my class, I have at the very beginning of the quarter, I have them do like a little intake survey, where they get to tell me a little bit about themselves, like any challenges they have with education. And I have 2 questions. The first question is, how do you feel about using generative AI for your own work? Right. And why do you feel that way? And the second one is, how would you feel if I use generative AI to grade your work, and why?
Mhm.
And it's hilarious. Like, I'm surprised that they don't see the contradictions, because when it's their work, they're like, I think it's great. Some of them are like, I couldn't imagine a day without using generative AI. I use it for everything. It's good for brainstorming. It's good for editing. I mean, I would say probably 2/3 of the students have that response.
Mhm,
There's
mhm,
some
mhm,
who are like, I would never use it. I think it's cheating and I hate it, or
mhm.
I don't want to surrender my own like autonomy. So I don't want to say that all students are like this, but a lot of them say, I use AI all the time. I think it's great. It's good for generating ideas, for pointing me to new resources, etc. But then the question about me using it,
Yes.
they're like, I would feel cheated. I had one student who said, I would ask, what am I paying for with education? And I'm like, okay. And a lot of them say, I don't trust generative AI because it doesn't have the human element. And so I use that
Ah.
as a teaching point. I'm like, okay, like this is clearly what you want, right? Like you submit something and you want a human to read it. And I'm like, I think we want the same things. I think you want a human to engage with your work, and I want to engage with human work. And I was like, we're not at odds with each other. We both want to feel human and feel seen as human. So that's like my favorite teaching moment. And then it all goes downhill the rest of it. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
Uh,
I see me stealing that very
yeah.
soon.
Yeah. And I highly recommend it. It's what I recommend to like my faculty, especially the ones who are like super resistant to even
Mhm.
using any AI. I was like, you can have the conversation without using any AI. Like just ask these 2 questions and see what happens. So my first master's, I did modern literature, and I feel like there's a lot of overlap in terms of like the really foundational questions I have in my
Oh.
both grad programs,
Mhm.
because I'm really interested in how technology impacts society, right? And
Oh.
so my literature master's was, I was looking at 19th century French realism, and I was looking at how sort of like industrialization and sort of Enlightenment ideals created this way of looking at the world that was like super scientific, and looking at different technologies like electrification, railroads, like um, all of these different things, and how it impacted our sense of time, space, family, like gender, all of these things.
Mhm.
And that is kind of what led me to the second master's, was just thinking about, okay, AI is this new technology, and
Mhm.
it is impacting society in so many different ways. One, like it's even before generative AI, right? Like I consider social media, part of this AI conversation, right? It's not just ChatGPT.
Mhm.
And so, that was part of why I chose it. And that's sort of the overlap, or the sort of through line in these 2 programs, was just thinking about how do new technological advancements change the ways that we relate to ourselves, the ways we relate to each other, and the ways that we relate to the world. Yeah. Anyway, that was, I wanted to remember to come back to that, because yeah.
That makes so much sense, and one of the things that I'm actually working on is we talked about how COVID completely reshuffled us,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like the plague did,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and then after the plague, you had this huge
Mm-hmm.
rush of humanity where we started looking at I think, therefore I am. We're going to look at the science instead of relying on dogma,
Mm-hmm.
right? It completely shifted us. And then now we have this thing called AI and
Mm-hmm.
how that is fundamentally shifting us as well. And again, being one of those that says, see, for me, AI is kind of like my superpower since I know how to talk to my computer.
Uh-huh.
I'm doing ridiculous things that I never dreamed of doing.
Like building off of what you're saying, I feel like all of these time periods, like the plague and the Renaissance, Enlightenment, industrialization, COVID and AI, like all of it, I mean, there's many questions connected, but the foundational question is like, what makes us human?
Yes.
Especially when we have these seismic disruptions
Yes.
in our human existence.
Yes.
Right? I mean, AI started as like, how do you get a computer to think like a human?
Mm-hmm.
These are questions about like, what is it to be human?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because I see a lot of colleagues who, like work with like, different chatbots, like they have, Play Lab or Nectar or,
Yeah.
and they're so excited because they're like, look what I taught my chatbot
Mm-hmm.
to do. Look what I got it to do. It's interesting because it is like how we used to talk about our students.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that still I'm processing as an educator. As much as I worry that our students over rely on generative AI, I also, as an educator, don't want to over rely on
Right.
AI. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I don't want to get so excited about what I teach a computer to do that I forget that my goal, right, is to like be better at teaching humans to do things.
That's the end goal. The point of teaching my AI to do something, right, is that it allows me to be a better teacher for the humans.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that perspective.
Yeah.
That's very powerful to think about it that way. It's almost permission, if that makes sense, to say, okay, this is why I'm spending time on this technology so that I can learn it to. This is why I'm doing this faculty professional development, because it allows me to be a better faculty member. It allows me to be a better teacher. And I love that permission aspect of that.
Yeah.
But without focusing so much on the tool itself that we forget that the tool is there to serve a purpose.
Yes. And I think that's the key. And this is something I wanted to say earlier about like another thing I realized like in my Fulbright research is that when we're talking about information, when we're talking about knowledge, so much of it is rooted in our identity, in our sense of identity.
Yes.
And I think that what's hard for a lot of educators, especially if we're asking these deep questions about like, what even is intelligence? What even is learning? What even is assessment? It's challenging the identity that they have formed as educators doing what they do the way they do it.
Yes.
That, requires a lot of neuroplasticity. It requires a lot of like, soul searching, and not everybody wants to do that. And like the permission to not do that either, but also to make sure that either as educators or students or anybody using these tools, that our identity doesn't get completely rooted in the tool itself. Like, let's remember that we are more than the tool. We are more than AI, right? I think this happened, with social media, right? It's like we kind of confused who the algorithm told us we were with who we actually are. And so that's what, and it's designed that way. It's designed to shape itself to like the things you like and the things that you linger on and the things that you don't like. And so we forget that it's separate from us, but we are more than the tools.
I really like how you tie it to social media, because we are commoditized by social media, right? Social media wants to categorize us in certain ways so that it can better package us, sell to us, and sell us. And AI in many ways is potentially doing the same thing. And how do we resist that, first of all, while knowing that we have to engage with this tool?
Yeah. That is the question. And I think this is why we need educators who are well-versed in both how the tools work and also the limitations, right? Even before ChatGPT, I used to do this exercise with students where I was like, look at your explore page and tell me who you are, right? Or look at like, put in this phrase in Google and the search results tell me a little bit about who you are, if you're not using an anonymous search, right? And now I have a new assignment that's like, it's called Who Does AI Think You Are? And I tell them to create a persona. It could be actually based on you. You could make something up, give it at least 10 characteristics like age, race, gender, where you live, where you go to school, whatever. And then ask it to generate 2 lists of news sources for you based on that persona, and to ask it to explain why it chose those news sources. And then I say, now write a reflection. Like, do you agree? Do you disagree? Why do you think it recommended these things? What did the recommendations tell you about its biases? And of course, by the time this episode airs, that'll be an obsolete assignment. But I, but I think that like we have to engage critically with it. Like we have to ask those questions around like, do I agree with what it's telling me or who it's telling me I am or what it's telling me to believe? Because I think it's so much easier to just take it at face value, so much easier to copy and paste than it is to actually be like, do I agree with this? Do I want this to
Yeah.
be a reflection of me?
And is this the work you're doing as part of the California Learning Labs, faculty innovators in residence strategy team, or first?
Through California Learning Lab, I'm really fortunate that I was tasked with running a learning community, intersegmental. So it means like with community colleges, Cal States, and UCs, we just put a call out. Anybody who is interested in AI and teaching and learning, we're running this pilot. And it really was, in my mind, about building community, because I think that, as we kind of talked earlier, so many people are just freaked out and stressed and burned out. So I was like, how can we gather and just create like a safer space for people to talk about what their fears are with AI and what they're doing that's exciting, and lessons learned, best practices, all of that stuff. That was my main project through Learning Lab. I really enjoyed it. I think that we don't have enough space for people to have these conversations. Coming from my own background of like, very emotionally unavailable childhood upbringing, like if you don't if you don't have opportunities to talk about how you're feeling, like the stuff gets buried and it's harder to function if you're not able to air what's coming up for you, when scary things happen.
I wanted to tie it to the AI first is I feel like everything that you're talking about means that the role of educators is so much more important than it ever has been. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying this just because this is, part of what I do.
Yeah.
It's up to us, right, to really critically examine AI because
Mm-hmm.
it's much more pervasive, invasive, all the other
Mm.
is for than social media. I feel
Yeah.
it permeates every aspect of our lives, and we need to really consider what it does to and with us.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm really curious about you have a more global perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? Having a lot more exposure around the world to different areas.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is more Asian, but I feel like you kind of have, Europe and Asia, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Like, what can we do as educators here, abroad, across the world? What can we do to better help our communities, not just our students, but our communities? Because, we want to fix society's problems.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh, that's that's a big question. And I will also say that a lot of my sort of adult research and experience and expertise has been primarily based in Asia. I mean, yes, I grew up in
Mhm.
Switzerland and I still have conversations with folks there. The EU was doing a lot of really great work at the beginning around like,
Yeah.
AI policy,
Yeah.
regulations. And I think just historically, like their support of social services is a good model,
Mhm.
because I do think that these technologies have the capacity. I mean, they're already like causing serious like economic disruptions. And I
Mhm.
think that people who are worried that AI is going to take their jobs have like, valid fears, because
Mhm.
it is taking over a lot of certain kinds of work. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean that there aren't going to be jobs. It just means in the lag time between the jobs that are automated and the development of new jobs, some people are really going to suffer. And people are
Mhm.
already suffering with the
Mhm.
sort of current economic situation. But what can we do as educators? Maybe this is my extrovert privilege, but I'm like, talk to people, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, and I know that that's not available to everybody, but I do think like having a conversation with your student, especially if you suspect that they might be using AI and you think they should fail because of it, I would say like have a conversation with them first, because there are as many legitimate reasons for somebody to use AI as there are to not use AI. And just talking things through can provide a lot of insight. But I think also talking to each other, getting
Mm.
different perspectives. I mean, not just to our students, but talking to like other colleagues, other folks who can provide different takes on what you're experiencing, just not to invalidate you, but just to sort of say like, oh, well, this is how I approach it. I think that's really important. And then globally, oh gosh, if
I know I tossed that one at you.
yeah, I mean, obviously, like having human conversations with your colleagues scaled to a global level would be diplomacy, but I don't know if we're heading in that direction. Um, but I think For me, especially because of the work I do in Southeast Asia, I am very concerned about like global digital divides. And I know that like we've talked a lot about some of the more quote unquote existential risks of AI.
Right.
There are a lot of genuine like material
Yes.
concerns around the impact that
Yes.
AI is having,
Right.
environmental impact, the exploitative labor practices of like
Mm-hmm.
training and maintaining. And those are things that should be part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of the sort of critics of AI have adopted that sort of more like, oh, it's terrible for humanity kind of argument. But, folks like Timnit Gebru, Joy Bolamwini, Sophia Noble, like have done a lot of really great work of looking at like, what are the actual like everyday
Mm.
impacts of AI technologies on people, whether it's like
Mm-hmm.
predictive policing, facial recognition technologies. That's Joy Bolamwini's work, but also like the data labelers, right? Getting paid like, who are being exploited. For me, the global context, like that has to factor into the conversation. Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right, because we focus so much on those big existential issues because we have the privilege to do so,
Yeah.
right? And a couple of things that I've noticed that AI is really helping me reconsider my privileges, right?
Mm-hmm.
For example, I am first generation immigrant, but I sound like this because I picked up multiple languages at a young age. I actually have a colleague who has a stutter, and it's easy for me to reproduce my voice using AI cloning. No big
Mm-hmm.
deal, right? But then for people who maybe speak differently,
Mm-hmm.
different accents,
Mm-hmm.
different verbal
Mm-hmm.
patterns. What does that do to their psychological mental state? Does it make it worse? Does it make it better? What are the
Yeah.
things that are there? And I really, really appreciate that you brought up that this is a privilege that
Yeah.
we get to really focus on these existential stuff without really having to think about the day to day.
There was a really heated debate during COVID around whether or not we would procure Proctorio, right?
Oh, wow.
Which, in terms of ableism is a important example. Again, I recognize that there are colleagues with genuine concerns about,
Mhm.
academic dishonesty
Mhm.
and aren't quite sure what is the appropriate response or like way to mitigate academic dishonesty. In comes this tool, this tech company
Mhm.
trying,
Mhm.
again, like trying to make money, right? That has a tool that is flawed, right? And and these are like questions that we have to ask. Same thing with AI detectors. There's so much research on the sort of
Mhm.
linguistic, the dialect bias
Mhm.
of them. As an educator, you have to weigh that. Like, is your fear or concern around academic dishonesty, does that outweigh the fear or concern that you are going to disproportionately impact
Yes.
certain students? And
Yes.
again, like, I am not telling anybody what choices they make. I just think that
Mhm.
you have to realize that that is a choice you are making when you
Mhm.
make that
Mhm.
choice.
Educators don't have time to look at every
Yes.
single, and I feel like it maybe disproportionately impacts English,
Mhm.
right? Because
Mhm.
as a speech person, I have a speech at the end. The speech is the end of the project, and you still have to get up and talk. We're still relatively protected. For me, the outline, the essays, anything we write are steps to that.
Mhm.
From the English perspective, right? How do you check every single one? What are these unintentional biases? And again, they're
Yeah.
unintentional. We're not trying to discriminate against our students.
Yeah.
But what are these unintentional biases
Yeah.
that could be reflected, not just by ourselves, but through our technology?
Yeah. The reason AI is biased is because humans are biased, right? Well, one, I've changed my grading
Yes.
processes. So I don't, I mean, I do contract grading
Mhm.
and we create expectations like as a group. The other thing is that when I suspect that a student has used it, I just say, can you meet with me?
Yeah.
And then I have a conversation with them. And I agree, it's labor intensive and a lot of faculty don't have time. So I'm
Mhm.
not trying to say that this is like the solution. I'm saying this is what I've decided to do. I personally try to prioritize like the human connection. And I just say, oh, like, can you tell me a little bit about your writing process? And I don't think this is just for English. I think any class that has like written assignments, right, is
Yeah.
susceptible to this. So I say, like, what was your writing process? Like, oh, well, like I'm noticing like as you're having a conversation with me, your tone and your vocabulary is slightly different. So I was like, oh, can you tell me like how did you choose some of these words? I just want to like make sure that you are aware that you're responsible for everything in your submission, unless you have cited that you've used other tools. And if turns out that they've used generative AI, I'm like, oh, then you need to cite it, and they were like, how do I cite it? And so then I go through like MLA format and I'm like, okay, every phrase, everything that was like not written by you have to put in quotation marks and put the link to the thing. Like doing it ethically takes so much more time for them that they're just like, all right, forget it. I'll just write it myself.
Exactly.
And so then it is a constant conversation. And I understand not everybody has capacity to do that. That's what I see as like my new role as a teacher is really just like, basically, how do I encourage students to have conversations with me?
And I wanted to pull something else that you said, trust rehumanizing. And kind of like as a way to kind of bring a conclusion to a lovely, wonderful talk, because I think this can go on for the next 3 hours, is the idea of like, what do you mean by that? And how might that be a way forward for us as educators, for us as a society, as we are going to be dealing with an AI world for the rest of our lives?
Yeah, for me, I think trust is the key, because it is the thing that I see is most depleted right now in our society. Trust and compassion are probably the most depleted, but I think compassion comes from trust, right? It's trust of humans. It's trust of the information that we're being given. It's trust of institutions, right? Like how many students, like not just students, but like people in US culture have lost trust in the institution of education.
Yes.
It's not by accident, right? I'm not saying that like the institution sucks and that's why people lost it. It's like there have been concerted efforts to erode the trust in it. And outdated like policies and practices that have also eroded that trust. Enter generative AI, which has further eroded trust among the humans within that institution, right? And this is another reason why I discourage AI detectors, is because it promotes that culture of distrust. Right?
Yes.
You get a lot of false positives.
Like trust our students instead of this piece of technology.
Yeah. Part of trust, I think, is also good faith. Like I think that we have just assumed that people are doing things because they're bad people.
Yes.
And I, tend to come from a more restorative justice perspective. Obviously if somebody is like hurting you, abusing you, don't like, get out of that situation, right? As soon as you can, right? Get to a safe place. But I think that if somebody's being dishonest, for me as an educator, my goal is to get at what is the deeper cause that has led that person to engage in any kind of, if it's academic dishonesty. I had a student who was homeless, and learning that and realizing that that was a lot of the reason why the student was using generative AI to complete assignments. I was like, look, I want to know what your voice is. I want to know what you actually think. And it's okay if it's grammatically incorrect right now. It's okay if it's not the most sophisticated thing you've ever written. And I think that's also what students need. Like they don't trust themselves. They don't trust their own thinking. They don't trust their own voice.
Yes.
And they know that the teacher, there might be this culture of distrust in the classroom.
Right.
I try to, as much as possible, create that safer space in the class so that students feel like they can bring their authentic selves, even if it's messy, even if it's grammatically incorrect, or like doesn't have the most sophisticated vocabulary. I'm like, as much as you want a real human to grade your work, like I want you to show up as a real human, and then we can actually get some learning done.
I love that wonderful human touch, especially that we can use this as a vehicle to better relate and communicate and connect with each other. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. This was such an awesome conversation.
This was such a wonderful, deep conversation where we covered a lot of ground. I feel like we were able to touch on some very deeply important things that are shifting because of AI and why we need to be human.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Innovating Higher Ed podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing and sharing it with your colleagues and friends. Be sure to join us for our next episode as we boldly explore new frontiers in educational innovation.